Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute, and I do appreciate you being with me. Hope you had an absolutely fantastic weekend. My wife and I got to visit our grandkids for just a little brief period of time. That was good. We don't get to see them all that very often. But it was good. We got to go to a dance recital with our granddaughter. She's a marvelously gifted dancer. No prejudice at all on my part, you understand. But nonetheless, she truly is. She wins. She has won national awards, all sorts of regional awards. So I'm telling the truth when I say she really is a very, very gifted little gal. So anyway, it was great to see them. Great to visit with our daughter and son-in-law. And it's good to be back with you. So we are continuing our discussion of the Olivet Discourse, and we've been focused on Matthew 25:31 and following. Now, follow my train of thought here. The coming of the Lord of Matthew chapter 25:31 and following is the second coming of Christ. Extremely, extremely few commentators ever doubt that, ever suggest anything different. I mean, it's almost unheard of. Now, that's true whether a person takes the preterist view, and that is that the second coming was in AD 70, or whether a person takes the view that the second coming is at the end of time. Virtually everyone admits that Matthew chapter 25:31 and following is the second coming of Christ, which means that it is the time of the new heaven and the new earth, foretold by Isaiah 65 and Isaiah 66. Now, I must say, I had someone just recently tell me Isaiah 65 is a totally different prophecy from Isaiah 66. Now, mind you, they gave no supporting evidence, because there's none there, and they gave no argument to prove that, but that was their claim. And so when I challenged them on it, they just completely dropped the subject and never said another word about it. I'll be really honest with you, that's the very first time I've ever heard anybody in all of my years suggest that the new heaven and new earth of Isaiah 65 is a totally different new creation from that predicted in Isaiah chapter 66. It's astounding. It's a brand spanking new argument as far as I'm concerned. So, the coming of the Lord of Matthew chapter 25:31 and following is the time of the coming of the Lord to bring in the new creation. It is also the time of the resurrection. I don't know of anybody really that denies that. With that thought in mind, we go to Isaiah chapter 25, 6 and following, and the Lord said, "On this mountain I will make a feast, a great feast, a feast of wine on the lees, a feast of fat things." That is the Messianic Banquet. It is commonly called the Messianic Wedding Banquet. It is also simply called the Resurrection Banquet. Because after all, the Lord said, "On this mountain I will make a great feast." And verse 8 says, and everything, verse 7 is connective. There's no reason, no justification, no evidence to suggest that verse 7 breaks the subject and has verse 6 taking place at one time and verse 8 taking place at another. I mean, it's just, well, again, it's a good illustration of argumentum ad desperatum when people try to make such arguments. I've already pointed out to you, Steve Gregg, in his argument on the resurrection, remember, Steve tells us, first of all, the Old Testament did not predict the resurrection. He argued that in my debate with him in 2013. But then in his book on Why Not for Preterism, he says, well, yes, indeed, the Old Testament did predict the resurrection. So you have Steve Gregg saying it did and it didn't. But one of the most amazing things that Steve foretold or said was that Isaiah chapter 25, verse 8, is a totally independent, standalone, parenthetic prophecy of the resurrection that is completely unrelated to the rest of the context. He admits, verses 1 to 7, a prediction of AD 70 in the first century. He admits, verse 9 and following, first century and AD 70. Oh, but verse 8 is supposedly just, an arbitrary, capricious insertion of a prophecy into the context that has zero to do with anything else. Well, the trouble of it is, the grammar of the text does not allow that. The contextual narrative does not allow that. Furthermore, verse 8 is, in this mountain. And verse 6 is, in this mountain. These are contemporary events to take place in that day. In that day, verse 6. In that day, verse 8 and 9. So once again, there's literally no justification whatsoever for Steve Gregg's argument on verse 8. So we've been exploring the issue of the Messianic Banquet. Now, I've already shown you from the context of Isaiah chapter 25 that the context of that banquet, and again, Steve Gregg admits, Steve Gregg agrees, the context is about the city of Jerusalem being turned into a city of foreigners. That is, it's conquered by foreigners and became a city of foreigners. Likewise, the temple, supposed to be the temple of Yahweh, has now been turned over and turned into a temple of pagans. That's the context. And it's in that day that the Messianic Banquet is established. So to put this as succinctly as possible, verses 1 to 7 foretold the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. Verse 6 says, in that day the Lord shall make a great banquet on this mountain. In the day of the fall of Jerusalem, AD 70. And by the way, some people like to say, well, now that's not true, Preston. Because Isaiah 25 is talking about the Assyrian captivity. No, it's not. Do you not realize that the city of Jerusalem was not destroyed by the Assyrians? Do you not understand that the temple was not captured by the Assyrians? All you have to do is read Isaiah chapter 36 and 37. The Assyrians were before the walls, to be sure. About 185,000 of them died in one night, and Sennacherib went back home to Nineveh, where he was killed, and his son Shalmaneser began to reign in his stead. So you can't say that Isaiah chapter 25 is about the Assyrian invasion, because the Assyrian invasion did not destroy the city of Jerusalem, did not turn it into a city of foreigners and destroy it, and it did not destroy the temple and turn the temple into a temple of foreigners. Just didn't happen. So, all of that said, all right, here we have the prediction of the Messianic resurrection banquet. A feast of fat things, a feast of wine on the leaves, a feast of bone and marrow. In what is, in my estimation, one of the most overlooked New Testament eschatological texts, Jesus draws directly on this motif of the Messianic banquet. Now, by the way, let's not forget that this Messianic banquet is the time in which the Lord said, my servant shall eat, you, O covenant Israel, shall be hungry. My servant shall drink, you shall be thirsty. My servant shall sing for joy of heart, you shall wail for sorrow of heart. And then follows the prediction of the new heaven and the new earth. Just like Isaiah 25, The banquet follows the destruction of the city and the temple. In Isaiah chapter 65, the Messianic banquet is given in direct contact, direct association with the destruction of Old Covenant Israel and the arrival of the new heaven and new earth. And Isaiah 25 puts the banquet in direct association with resurrection. The banquet is for the resurrected. Now then, in this passage that I have suggested to you just now, is one of the most overlooked, I would even say ignored by some people, one of the most overlooked but highly significant eschatological texts is Matthew chapter 8. Jesus is approached by the centurion, very powerful man. He's in charge of 100 men in the Roman army. And he comes to Jesus and said, Master, my servant lies ill at home. And he's about to die. And Jesus says, I will come and I will heal him. And the centurion says, no, do not do that. There's no need for that. Speak the word only and my servant shall live. And Jesus is astounded at the man's faith. And he says, I have not found so much faith, no, not in all of Israel. Now watch this. He is dealing with a pagan Roman, a Gentile. A Gentile who has demonstrated incredible faith in him. And Jesus says, I've not seen that much faith in all of Israel. And verily I say unto you, watch this, many will come from the east and the west, and shall sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom, and the sons of the kingdom shall be cast out. What is this? Many shall come from the east and the west and sit down, more literally, recline at the table. Folks, virtually all commentators are agreed. This is the Messianic wedding banquet. It is the Messianic resurrection banquet. Now, you see, Jesus is dealing with a pagan. He's dealing with a Gentile. He's not dealing with an Israelite. Because after all, he contrasts the faith of this Roman centurion with Israel, with all of Israel. But the key point, you see, is this man, this pagan, has been accepted by Christ and blessed by Christ. And he says, many will come from the east and the west. That's a reference to other Gentiles. Now, some try to make that simply nothing more than the restoration of Israel. And it's certainly true that the 10 northern tribes were scattered to the east and to the west. And it's certainly true that there were the prophecies of the gathering of the 10 northern tribes from the east and the west. But it's also true that pagans were from the east and from the west. Well, how do I know that? Well, because the 10 northern tribes had been scattered and dwelt among the Gentiles. Hosea chapter 8, verse 8. Hosea chapter 9. So Israel was among the Gentiles. They were not the Gentiles. They were among the Gentiles. They and others from the east and the west would come and sit down in the kingdom, in the Messianic banquet. Now, here's a question for you. Do you believe that when a child of God dies, they go directly to heaven? Very, very, very few people, those in the all-millennial Church of Christ circles, deny that, but they're wrong. But you see, people today, most Christians today, believe that we are in the kingdom, and we are in the kingdom with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Wait a minute. Folks, if Abraham and Isaac and Jacob are in the kingdom reclining at the Messianic wedding banquet, you've got to catch the power of what I'm about to say. It means the resurrection has occurred. And you know, it's amazing to me how many postmillennialists believe. It's amazing to me how many Reformed amillennialists believe that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are reclining at the Messianic banquet now. But let me say this again. You've absolutely got to catch the power of it. The Messianic banquet is the Messianic resurrection banquet. So if Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are reclining at the banquet now, what does that mean? It means the resurrection has occurred. To put that another way, if Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are currently at the table now, at the Messianic banquet, not only has the resurrection taken place, but I think it's really, really obvious based upon that we're not talking about biological human bodies, decayed human bodies coming out of the grave, being restored and raised out of the dirt, right? And when would this take place? Well, in Luke chapter 13, 28 to 33, Jesus said the same thing, only added something very, very graphic to it. You will see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom, and you yourselves cast out. Let me ask you a question. Was Old Covenant Israel cast out in AD 70? Well, Paul said in Galatians 4 that Old Covenant Israel was going to be cast out for persecuting the church. And that's 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, by the way. If Old Covenant Israel has not been cast out, then they must be guilty now, or they must be guilty at some point of time in the future of persecuting the church to such an extent that they will be cast out. But you know, I know, Paul's referring to first century persecution of the church by the Jews. And it was for that persecution that they were going to be cast out. But you see, the Jews, the Old Covenant Jews, the kingdom was going to be taken from them and given to a nation bringing forth the fruit thereof, Matthew chapter 21, verse 43. And Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would be raised from the dead to sit at the banquet. Folks, listen, let me say this again. If Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are currently residing at the Messianic resurrection banquet, then the resurrection has taken place. Jesus wasn't talking about, this banquet being held in Hades. There had to be a change in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Had to be a change in their position and condition. They would be raised to recline at the resurrection banquet. Final time, if Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are currently residing at and enjoying the Messianic banquet, they have been resurrected. But that means that the resurrection is not the raising of dead, decomposed human corpses out of the dirt. This is the significance of Matthew 8. It is the significance of the Messianic banquet. And tomorrow, I'll show you even more. After all, Matthew chapter 8 and Luke chapter 13, that banquet, when would it be established? When the sons of the kingdom are cast out. When you yourselves, Jesus said to the Jews, are cast out. And I'm going to nail that down tomorrow on the flip side. In the meantime, I have a tremendous discussion of Matthew chapter 8, verse 11 in this book. And you can purchase it and my other book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings. You can save yourself almost $18 by going to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com. There's a banner up at the top. Click on it. Order those two books. You're not going to find a discussion of Matthew chapter 8, verse 11 as in-depth, as comprehensive, and as convincing as you'll find in my book on Daniel chapter 12. I'll see you on the flip side.